Welcome to The Big Picture with Katrina Fulcher-Ruud and Anny Castilla-Earls, where they discuss how research in speech-language pathology can be implemented in daily clinical practice. Hi everyone, and welcome back to The Big Picture. I'm Katrina.
And I am Annie.
And we get to be back in Buffalo with all of the cold weather and snow.
Tons of snow.
Which Anny is getting back used to coming from Texas. Anny, why don't you tell everybody what we want to talk about today?
So today we're going to talk about the assessment of English language learners. We have a very important article that was published in 2015 by Johanne Paradis. And it is right now in the online form only, so it's not printed, so it's 2015, but probably will be in press in 2016 in the actual journal.
And what about this article was critically important? Because what we want to do is bring you guys the main points of this article and how that impacts clinical practice. So what's the first thing that Paradis talks about?
Well, remember I am a specialist in bilingual assessment, correct? And even for me, there were two pieces of information that were key that we want to share with you today. One, is related to the type of errors that typically developing children make more than children with language impairments.
And what is that error that we expect typically developing children to make more?
So children who are English language learners tend to produce more errors of overregularization than children with typical development.
And for people that don't know, because as an AAC person, this was a little new for me. So what does overregularization mean?
It means that the child will use, in this case, the past ED for verbs that are irregular.
Oh, I've had some children like that. They've said, I goed.
Correct.
Or I sitted.
Correct.
Or I eated.
Correct.
So they take that ED and they put that ED on irregular verbs. They over-regularize or overuse that ED ending.
Correct, and that's what is interesting about that, because in some ways we're finding that typically developing children make more errors of this type. And it's a little bit counterintuitive with what we expect with typically developing children. But this type of error is very interesting because it's a little bit of a reflection of the fact that the children are learning the rules of the language. So it seems that typically developing children are making this error more often just because there is more insight about them learning the rules of the language.
And bilingual children, they'll also do this over-regularization?
Yes, correct. So children who are English language learners or bilingual children tend to make this error more often than bilingual children who have language impairments.
And that's good, because that could be a potential indicator, something for us to keep an eye out for in our assessment, that if we have that bilingual children that's doing this over-regularization, that's a good positive indicator for us that they're learning English.
Correct.
And what was that other main point from the Paradis article that you found that would be really important for the speech pathologists who are working with English language learners?
Well, I always get asked this question when I am giving talks or when I'm talking to other people about English language learners, and the question is always, how long does it take to a child to learn the second language?
Yes.
Right? That is always a question. So how long should we expect? Because a lot of schools or a lot of practitioners around the United States like to do the wait and see approach, which is, let's wait a couple of years while they learn English, right? Because they're going to learn English so quickly, we'll see what happens.
Sometimes it's, let's wait 6 months, let's wait a year, half the school year.
Correct. It's not that we are advocating in any way by the wait and see approach, but people like to know that number in one way is to support the wait and see approach. So what Johanne Paradis say in her article, which is a collection of her research for the past, I think, 10 years, is that it takes at least 3 years for a child to score in tests that are developed for monolingual children within the normal range. And that 3 year is still very early. That's the minimum.
So there's some children that are going to exceed that 3-year benchmark. They're going to maybe go into 4 years or maybe greater. We're still figuring that out as researchers. Correct. But at minimum, 3 years to score typical scores of monolinguals before we can really compare a bilingual's language development to that of a monolingual language development.
Considering, even if you could at some point, right? The main point here is we shouldn't be using any English testing, you know, comparing with the norms before 4 or 5 years for those children. It's not really a true representation of their language skills.
And so I know that we always do advocate for testing in especially the native language, and Paradis had one really good point that if you can't test in the native language, what is something that our clinicians can do?
So she's advocating strongly for the use of good questionnaires for the parents. And she and her colleagues have developed a really good questionnaire that has shown to have really good sensitivity and specificity at identifying in children with language impairments.
So, Anny, what is the big picture? What should our clinicians focus on?
So the big picture is, if you are working with English language learners, you need to remember that it will take at least 3 years for these children to look a little bit similar, to their native English peers, right? Also, a good error to have for a typically developing children who is an English language learner is the overregularization of the past tense in the third person. And the last point is, if you cannot have access to the assessment of the first language, because maybe in your school district there is not a bilingual SLP, or you don't have the access to interpreters, is to get good questionnaires to identify language impairments using the parents as a resource. And as always, please make sure to ask us questions. Let us know if you try this. Let us know if this is feasible, how this can work in your clinical practice. You can email us at thebigpicturevlog@gmail.com. Leave a comment below or follow us on Facebook. And thank you so much for joining us today. And remember to keep on thinking about the big picture.